The blood swept lands and seas of red. Those are the words that one anonymous First World War soldier used to describe the killing fields of the trenches. The blood swept lands and seas of red. The same words that inspired 888,246 ceramic poppies, each one representing a British or colonial death during that conflict. The first one planted in the moat at the Tower of London in July, the final one to be added 2 days hence. The blood swept lands and seas of red. It comes as part of a larger project commemorating the First World War this year and over the next 3 to come. A project that the Tower has based around 3 questions. How do you want to remember? Why is 100 years significant? And why should we remember? You can engage with that national debate on Twitter if you so choose, or you can go in person and leave your remarks at the Tower. But I thought that those 3 questions would be a good framework for us to engage in our thinking this morning. How do you want to remember? Well, this is how we remember right here, meeting as we do this morning and as we will this afternoon at the War Memorial. But I think, in a way, the question is a little bit misleading. To remember is to bring to mind something from your past. To remember, you need to have at least first done or experienced the thing that you're seeking to remember. For me, and for much of my generation, World War I is as much my past as the English Civil War. It's not so much how do I want to remember as how can I learn. That distinction, I think, takes us to the second question. Why is 100 years so significant? Well, 100 years is that symbolic moment where events go from being lived personal experience, memory, into being black ink in the textbook. It was in 2009, 5 years ago, that the last surviving European trench soldier, an amazing man called Harry Patch, died. You need to be at least 96 to have even been born during the First World War. You need to be the other side of 100 to have much of a chance of remembering anything about it. Why is 100 years significant? Because we choose now what's remembered. We choose which spin of the facts becomes the overarching narrative that generations to come will learn. We're moving from memory to imagination, and we're even moving from memory to the unimaginable. Why should we remember? Well, what I know firsthand about war is basically nothing. No generation has ever had so much of it beamed into their living rooms and yet experienced so little violence in their day-to-day lives. And that carries with it a danger. It's frightening and quite clarifying that I could turn on the television and for a good few moments not know whether I was watching news footage or the latest Hollywood action thriller. My sense of reality is damaged. Fantasy and reality arrive into my living room via the same medium. And that leads to a great danger, a danger that I think I know, that we think we know what war is about, that we think we're living in dark times, that we think we know something about inhumanity. But oh my goodness, how little of that most of my generation have ever experienced. Last year, war deaths increased slightly because of the conflicts in Syria and Iraq. But there were still fewer than half the number of deaths than any given year in the 20th century. The homicide rate in England has dropped to nearly half of what it was even in the year 2000. Global homicides continue to fall year upon year. My goodness, how little my generation knows of inhumanity. J.H. Rushmore, a congregational minister preaching in 1917 towards the end of the war, said these words: "So far from the occurrence of the war being a condemnation of our ideals of peace, everything associated with its origin and cause has confirmed our conviction that war is in itself irrational, morally indefensible, barbarous." Those words only seem more true today as we become less and less experienced, less and less accustomed to war and to all forms of violence. Those are words that it's easy for me to preach because it costs me so very little to say them, as compared to the great bravery that it must have cost Rushmore to preach them in 1917. They're words that it's easy for me to preach because pacifism seems to me so much so at the heart of Christ's gospel. General Patton, the American general, is attributed to have said, and I think he probably used rather cruder words than these, that no man ever won a war by laying down his life for his country. He won it by making the other poor, dumb man lay down his. It's a riff on the words that we heard from our gospel today. No one has greater love than this, than to lay down one's life for one's friends. We do well to remember that that's not the same as saying no one has greater love than this, than to kill for their friends. Christ didn't try to see how many people he could take down with him when he died on the cross and afterwards descended into hell. Quite the opposite. He tried to see how many people he could raise up with him. Why should we remember? Because war is so far outside of our experience as to border on the unreal. It's so far outside of our experience to border on the unimaginable. But remembering is a chance to taste the undiluted saltiness of blood-swept lands and seas of red. I spoke to a man last year. He was one of the British troops who had liberated the concentration camp of Bergen-Belsen. He told me that war was ugly and evil. He said that it was irredeemable and repulsive. He said there was never any situation in which it could be condoned. And yet he said that because of what he saw at that camp, he would do it all again. He said that it was ugly and evil, that it was irredeemable, repulsive, it could never be condoned, and he would do it all again. Such is the complexity and the paradoxical nature of war. And that's taken up so well by those 888,000 copies. They are undoubtedly a beautiful sight. And yet, as one commentator said, should it not be bones and barbed wire? What has beauty to do with this? We said this morning, and these words will echo out across this nation today, we will remember. And yet the artist made so clear that from Wednesday, that piece of work needs to recede and disappear and disperse. 888,000 heroes, each one of them, and yet the loss of such intense life, an act of utter foolishness. It's so obviously true that one does not create peace by committing acts of violence against others. And yet, again and again, we can think of no better way. Why should we remember? Because war is so deeply confusing, because it's so deeply paradoxical and contradictory. We can't afford the complacency of forgetting. And I would want to add one more question. Have we learned? And I think the answer is, well, yes, sort of. We have seen a continued decrease in global violence and war deaths. And I think the answer is also, well, no, sort of not. Consider this vignette. Under the shadow of austerity and economic unease, far-right nationalistic parties gain political power across Europe. Many nations, seeking a scapegoat, blame ethnic minorities for their problems and pursue isolationist policies. Meanwhile, just 2 days ago, a world superpower, Russia on this occasion, pilots tanks across the border into neighbouring Ukraine. Does that have the ring of familiarity about it? That bubbling and boiling situation of European politics. Have we heard that before? If we have learnt, now is the time for us to speak like brave Christians and churches did in the past. Now is the time for us to speak particularly against those within our own nation whose policies cannot lead to openness, to global fellowship, to generosity of spirit. Now is the time for us to speak out against those who would cause nation to lift up sword against nation, against those who would seek to teach us war. Now is the time for us to speak out against those who would lead us down a path that ends only in blood-sweat lands and seas of red. Amen.